One of the reasons I'm optimistic about the Florida Gators in 2025, their schedule is easier this year than it was last year.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Locked On Gators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. Every day we are available daily and free reviews in the podcast and on YouTube. Happy Wednesday. I am Brandon Olsen. Find me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with New York Giants on SI. And the Florida Gators schedule in 2025 is going to be easier than it was in 2024, okay? And I want to say that to let everybody know that that's one of the reasons I think Florida goes over the 6.5 win total. But also one of the reasons that I'm more optimistic about the team this year. I've said for a long while now, I think Florida's built a fantastic roster. It's just about coaching catching up. And we've talked about Florida internally, but we haven't talked too much about what the other schools have going on, right? And for Florida, the first thing that when they bring up the schedule is because 2025 and 2024, the home games just flipped. So people bring up the argument that, which is the counterpoint to why many people thought Florida would have a good year last year, despite the tough schedule, is the amount of home games that they had. Now, it's the amount of away games. That's usually what people bring up when they say, oh yeah, like this year might be tougher because they have more away games. But those away games are LSU, Miami, Texas A&M, Kentucky, and Ole Miss. And while we don't have the time slated for any of those games, I can tell you that LSU is really scary at night. But outside of LSU, I don't think any of those teams are truly fearsome to me anymore. And that's not to take a shot at anybody. That's just me genuinely saying that I just don't think that some of these teams are as, again, scary as they were last year or as they've been in the past, we'll say. Because Texas A&M, they as a team look good, but the home environment just doesn't, honestly, it's just not that scary to me anymore. Like, I feel like people used to think of Kyle Field as this just really treacherous place to come into and try to play at if you're a road team, and it used to be thought of as this dominant force. I just don't view it that way anymore. I mean, they won quite a bit at home, right? Their home losses in 2024 were to Notre Dame and Texas. So great teams. They beat Missouri, they beat LSU, beat New Mexico State, beat Bowling Green, and beat McNeese State. It's just, to me, when I look at them, I don't think of them as one of those dominant home environments like I used to. And I absolutely used to think that they were that kind of team, that they were just a team where it was really, really tough to go in there and beat them as a road team. But it just hasn't felt that way. I feel like Jimbo, and they're still, like, I feel like Jimbo kind of killed it for a little bit, and that they're still kind of recovering from what Jimbo Fisher did. Like last year, they didn't think they'd be as good as they were, so people didn't buy in right away. This year, maybe that's different, but basing it off of last year and the past few years, Texas A&M, Kyle Field, not as scary as it used to be. So outside of LSU, I don't think that there are any real scary environments anymore like they used to. And again, they're still great environments, but scary. Like when I look at the road games, I look at Miami, and even as an away game, in-state, Florida's going to have good representation there, right? You look at every away game that's even close, and Florida's got pretty good representation there. So I don't look at that as that scary of a road environment. Miami fans, go ahead, clip it all you want. I know I'm going to see it at some point on Twitter. So that's fine. Texas A&M, like I've said, not that scary of an environment for me. And also, we'll go back to LSU. LSU at night, incredibly tough environment to go into. they tend to get night games. Hell, this will probably be a night game. But if it's not too scary. And if it is, I do hate that this is so early because LSU was kind of on quit watch last year. And they could be on quit watch again if things don't go their way early on. So LSU, the only truly fearsome road environment, we'll say, for the Florida Gators in 2025. Miami, again, it's not even like I'm not going to take a shot at their little rent-a-stadium or whatever it is. I'm not going to take a shot at that. I'm just going to say it's an in-state home game. It's easy to show up. Texas A&M, I've said, not as scary as they used to be. Kentucky, I feel like that whole program's on just life support right now. Like, I feel like that program is, if they didn't beat Ole Miss last year, that program might have just shut down. If they didn't beat Ole Miss last year, they might have just been like, you know what? We're just going to take 2025 off. But they beat Ole Miss, so they got to keep going. So Kentucky, not a team that I think of as a very scary team last year. And then last year, I mean, look, speaking of Kentucky and Ole Miss, that's where Kentucky beat Ole Miss. That's where it happened. I don't think of Ole Miss as one of the, when we talk about like a dominant SEC stadium, I don't think of Ole Miss as one of those. And maybe that's my fault, but I don't view them that way. So when we talk about more away games, sure. But are they very scary away games? I don't think so. That could just be me kind of glossing over it, but I don't think of them as scary away games at all. And last year, Florida didn't have many scary away games, but guess what they did have? They did have an away game against Tennessee, and they always show up at Neyland for the Florida Gators. And they had an away game at Texas. So they had two. So the way that I look at it when I compare it to last year, I'm like, hey, well, I'd rather have this year's road schedule than last year's road schedule. You got some pretty good teams on there, but as far as environments that truly rattle teams, it's LSU, and that's kind of it, if you're asking me. Kentucky did a couple years ago, one time, rattle Florida, and Kingsley Eguakin just kept getting the penalties, and Dan Mullen did not make adjustments when he should have. But outside of that, not so much. Also, quarterbacks, roster continuity, not a ton for the opposing teams on the Florida Gators schedule. We'll talk about that when we get back with Locked On Gators. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC, and I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps me get back into a routine. Or, like someone so kindly commented yesterday, that really, like, Wayfair is kicking my rear end right now. Not in a bad way. It's just there's so many things. I don't know what I want to decide, but redoing the living room. And like in redoing the living room, it's like, oh, well, we're kind of redoing the hallway decoration. It's just, it's a lot. I'm not going to lie to you. It's a lot, but Wayfair does have everything we need, and it's all within our budget. And I'm not a Rockefeller. Okay. I'm not, I'm going to let you know that, but Wayfair also has free and hassle-free delivery, even for larger items. I ain't carrying a couch up the stairs. My family's moved. I'm not calling them to come travel, and then we got to spend all day. We're not doing that. We're just not. Give your home the refresh it needs with Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's Wayfair, WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day every day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to the podcast and on YouTube. And like we mentioned last segment, there's the away games this year, or this segment. Most of the teams on Florida's schedule, most of the Power 4 teams, will have a different QB1 to start 2025 than they had in 2024, right? Like just going down the list of the schedule, and Power 4, LSU has Garrett Nussmeier back. That's one. Miami has maybe Carson Beck. I'm not even taking a shot. I genuinely just don't know what his status is after the elbow surgery. Texas is going to Arch. Texas A&M has Reed coming back for another year, and he's going to be starting this time. Mississippi State are the freshman that's back. Georgia, they don't know who's going to be their starting QB yet. Kentucky, Zach Calzada? Ole Miss, Austin Simmons, one-time Florida Gators commit. Tennessee's got Nico back, but I don't care about him. And Florida State has Thomas Castellanos coming in. You got 6 of your Power 4 opponents, which you've got, 10 Power 4 opponents? 6 of them are bringing in new starting quarterbacks from 2025 to 2024. I'm just saying, when we talk about that, and that was one of the things that, was it Jesse Palmer was talking about it during, I think, the Texas game, because that was when Billy Napier got the vote of confidence. And Jesse Palmer was basically like, hey, no, you bring Billy back for 2025 because next year the quarterbacks you play are going to be worse. 2 things about that. 1, we don't know that they're going to be worse. We just know that they're going to be new. And 2, that's a coward thing to say, okay? I'm not bringing someone back because next year's schedule is going to be weaker, right? I'm not bringing someone back for that. I'm bringing someone back because I think they can get the job done. I don't care about the strength of schedule, okay? Just want to get that loser mentality out of here. I'm not saying he's a loser. I'm just saying that's loser mentality to go, oh, well, next year the schedule is going to be worse. So you bring this guy back and then you're at an advantage. I want to be at an advantage because my coach is better. I want to be at an advantage because my team is better. Just want to make that one clear. Moving on to the quarterback bit. They're replacing quarterbacks. We don't know who's going to start at some of those spots. Again, we don't know who's going to start at Georgia. Miami, we don't know simply because we don't know what Carson Beck's status is going to be. I have no idea, no update on that. So really, you got 2 teams where you don't even know who's going to be the starting QB. You got a bunch of teams that are replacing their starting quarterback. That alone gives Florida a bit of an advantage. But even the teams that do have their starting quarterbacks coming back, they've undergone, we'll say, quite a bit of roster turnover, right? Which Florida hasn't really. Florida has done the best job this year than they've done in any year under Billy Napier of retaining their talent. They haven't brought in a ton of portal players this time. They haven't changed that, and that's great. They've got a lot of guys coming back. They spent their money on bringing guys back. But some of the teams that you are facing in 2025 have gone through quite a bit of roster turnover. I mean, Florida State brought in 16 guys from the portal. I don't have a problem with Miami's 11. I feel like 12 is kind of my point where I'm like, okay, if you're bringing in more than 12, more than 15, you're being a bit portal reliant. So Miami's 11 isn't that crazy. But you have Florida State bringing in 16 guys. I'm not about to start taking shots at South Florida. Not that I know what they did in the portal, but I'm not about to start taking shots at them. Just because, they're USF. They brought in 10 anyway, so it's not even that crazy. But you look at LSU, brought in 16. They have 16 incoming transfers. And I like a good portion of the additions, right? 2 of them are Florida Gators because they brought in Jack Pyburn on the edge, and they brought in Jakeem Jackson at cornerback. And we know what Jack Pyburn can be. We know what Jack Pyburn is. In fact, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say we don't know what he can be, but we know what he has been. Jakeem Jackson, we know what he can be. I think he could be really good. I've always been very high on Jakeem Jackson. I will not slander him. I don't think he had a good start to the season. I don't think he had a great 2023, but I think he showed traits that show you he can be great with some refinement. And so that's how I look at it for Jakeem Jackson. Ole Miss has 22 incoming transfers this year. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's not the most that Florida opponent has, but that's a lot for Ole Miss to have 22 guys. And it's interesting because last year they had a lot of transfer guys too. They played well. I think last year they had a better transfer class than they had this year, but we'll see what they can make of this year. But and also I'm not going to do the thing that so many people did with Florida State of, oh, well, he brought in a really good transfer class and made it work last year, so he could bring in a really good transfer class and make it work this year. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say that just because you've done it before, you can do it again. Or I'm not going to say just because you've done it before, you're going to do it again. Because we've seen Florida State happen. We know what they did, right? So we saw Florida State crumble. Not going to bank on that. Kentucky has 19 incoming transfers. 19 incoming transfers is crazy, especially considering Kentucky, not exactly a transfer portal hotbed. However, Kentucky also lost multiple receivers that they thought would be big-time contributors. That sucks. Also worth noting, as far as we're talking about incoming transfers, Florida plays LSU really early in the year, and LSU has a lot of new weapons. Could see a little bit of a time where they're still trying to figure that out, still trying to gel, and hopefully Florida can take advantage of that. So you've got that as well, with LSU having a lot of incoming transfers, Ole Miss a lot of incoming transfers, and LSU's got them on both sides. Like, it's not like they just went, hey, we need to load up the secondary, load up the defense. It's like, hey, we got edge, corner, linebackers, receivers, everything. We're bringing in everything new. That's a lot. Kentucky, 19, like I said, and Mississippi State, 24. And Mississippi State is maybe the one school where I don't fault them for having 24 incoming transfers because they stunk last year. Stunk. And the reason that that's different from Kentucky is because Kentucky stunk in year, 9 for Mark Stoops, something like that. Mississippi State stunk in year 1 for Jeff Lebby. We saw Florida do this when it's like, hey, we got to clear them all out and get in our guys. That's how I look at Mississippi State. That's why I'm not faulting Mississippi State, because we've seen Florida do that, and it wouldn't shock me if that was a similar situation with Mississippi State and Jeff Lebby. So Florida not only brings back a lot of players, a lot of production, but their opponents in 2025 also have it differently. And there's one thing that's not necessarily opponent independent here that I want to say is a reason that I like Florida's schedule in 2025. But we'll talk about it when we get back with Locked On Gators. Thanks again for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. Every day, we are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube. And to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Gators, we're going to talk about something that I kept mentioning last year. We're talking preseason. Things are going to change. Some teams are going to look better. Some teams are going to look worse. But last year, when we were talking about the 2024 schedule, we were talking about a schedule that, for me, the toughest part of it wasn't just, hey, you got to play tough teams. For me, the toughest part of it was there was no stretch where you face two bad teams. And again, we're talking about the preseason. I'm not talking about once games started getting played. It was Miami, then you had Samford. That's your easy team. But Texas A&M. And Texas A&M, good team. Then Mississippi State, that's your easy team. Then a bye week, and then UCF, who prior to the season, and even going into the game against Florida, we were like, oh, they're having a pretty good year right now. So you got that for Mississippi State to UCF, where UCF, it was thought to be a good team, ended up not being a good team. But in hindsight, Mississippi State and UCF was your easiest stretch. Mississippi State, bye week, UCF. Because then you had Tennessee, hell of a team, playoff team. Then Kentucky. Then you had Georgia, playoff team. Then you had Texas, playoff team. Then you had LSU, who at the time that you played them was like the down point of their season. Like that's when things started going to hell. Then you had Ole Miss, near playoff team. And then you had Florida State. That was easy, right? The thing was, prior to the season, we were like, oh, hey, Florida State might be pretty freaking good this year. So even if you thought Florida State would suck, there was no stretch of even 2 games where going into the season, we knew those games would be easy or we thought those teams would be bad. General consensus, I'm going to say. I know maybe you independently were like, hey, Mississippi State is going to suck, UCF's going to suck. But even then, that was SEC team and still a Power 4 program in UCF in the Big 12. So even then, your easiest stretch was two bad Power 4 programs, one of them being in the SEC. And we've seen in the SEC, it's the NFL. Any given Sunday, SEC's any given Saturday, anything can happen, right? And so for me, one of the reasons I thought Florida's schedule in 2025 was such a gauntlet was not just that you were playing elite team after elite team after elite team, but there was no stretch where you can say they weren't playing good teams. That wasn't a thing. My thing was that they had no break. They had no game where they can kind of just go, all right, like we can take the foot off the gas a little bit. This one should be an easy win. That wasn't a thing they dealt with. And so 2025, that changes, right? In 2025, you start the season with an easier 2-game stretch than you had at any point in 2024, even if you're talking about Mississippi State and UCF. Even if in hindsight, you're talking about that you start 2025 with an easier 2-game stretch than you had at any point during the 2024 season. You start the season there. So for me, that's one of the reasons that I talk about this and I say there's an easier stretch, right? Like there's an easier 2-game stretch to start the season in 2025 than there was at any point during the 2024 season. And nobody knows what the end of Florida's schedule is going to look like in 2025, right? Like you look at the last 4 games of the 2025 season and you watch that and you say, okay, well, Kentucky was not a good team last year, has a lot of transfers this year. I don't think they brought in a lot of good transfers. They lost a lot of key players. Think about their defensive line. They lost Deion Walker and Keyshawn Silver alone. Receivers, they lost Barian Brown and Dane Belton. Like they lost not Dane Belton, Dane Key. Dane Belton was the safety for the New York Giants. They lost Dane Key there. You lost key players in multiple spots. Their quarterback retired. You lost a lot. So no one knows what Kentucky's going to look like. We could assume they'll probably be pretty right? Ole Miss, they may still be ranked top 25, but I have no idea what they're going to look like. We have no idea what Austin Simmons is going to look like. This is going to be his first time playing big boy football on a larger stage and a larger scale. So we have no idea what he's going to look like. And they've got a lot of transfers as well. They lost a ton of guys, especially a ton of defensive talent. They're probably still going to have a pretty good defensive line, not going to lie. But they lost a lot of defensive talent for 2025. No clue what they're going to look like. Tennessee, no clue what they're going to look like. This was supposed to be their year where they took their best shot, right? Is Nico going to take the step that they thought he would take last year, which they shouldn't have thought he would take last year? Is their run game going to be able to replicate what they did? Is their defense going to be able to replicate what they did? No James Pierce this time. No idea what Tennessee's going to look like. In Florida State, we have no clue what they're going to look like, right? They neglected high school recruiting for a really long time. They've been too portal reliant, too portal dependent. Anything could happen with them. We have no clue what they're going to look like. So Florida could end the season on a pretty lighter schedule note. Could be interesting. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day every day. We are available daily and free reviews in the podcast and on YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Florida Gators football for Locked On Gators. I'm Brandon Olsen. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with New York Giants on SI, and I'll see you all next time.